A simple Christmas order goes ignored in Lochdu, setting off a chain of events that soon pulls Hamish Macbeth into quiet trouble. In this village, even small oversights can carry unexpected consequences. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. The Kirk Hall in Lochdu was too warm and smelled of damp wool, but no one seemed to notice except Hamish. The villagers were already in a bad temper before he arrived, and the heat only made it worse. Elderly crofters sat hunched on the metal chairs, muttering about tourists taking up space at the Christmas chalet. Mrs. Wellington stood with her arms folded, lips tight, lecturing the room about the state of the raffle prizes. Hamish eased himself into a seat at the back, hoping the wooden chair would not creak too loudly under him. Lugs lay at his feet, head on paws, tail flicking whenever someone raised a voice. Hamish scratched the dog's ear, but only made him sigh louder, which drew glances. Miss Grant, who had been glaring at everyone since the meeting began, shot Hamish a look full of suspicion, as if he were personally responsible for the chaos of the village. When the talk grew shrill again over whether the tourists should be allowed to request songs, Hamish cleared his throat. It came out louder than he meant. "Maybe," he said, "you could keep the music a bit quieter, for the hotel folk." He tried to make it sound helpful, but the room went cold in an instant. Mrs. Wellington stared at him as though he had sworn in church. "You're meant to be on our side, Hamish," she said. Another woman muttered that he was always fussing over the hotel people. Someone else sighed dramatically. The disapproval spread in a neat wave. Hamish wished he had said nothing. He stared at the floor while Lugs pressed close to his leg, ears down. When the meeting finally broke up, no one thanked him for attending. Mrs. Grant brushed past him at the door, murmuring that policemen should tend to crime instead of Christmas. He walked out into the evening rain with her voice echoing in his head, though he told himself he didn't care. The sky was low and felt heavier than it needed to be. By the time he reached the station, sleet slapped against the windows. The place was in its usual state after Anderson's shift. Half-drunk tea on the desk, forms in a crooked pile, and a damp smell that never quite left. Hamish hung up his coat and pushed the papers into something that looked almost like order. The fax machine gave a choking noise. It always did before working, as though offended by the very idea of communication. A long sheet crawled out, line by line, the ink smudging slightly where the heat rollers stuck. Hamish read the first heading, then read it again. A non-harassment order issued in Glasgow. Morag Drummond, Kenneth Fraser. Holiday arrangements. Conditions. A warning that Strathbane police must act with speed and discretion. A note from Daviot saying the matter was delicate and must not become public. Hamish rubbed the back of his neck. People from Glasgow brought trouble often enough, but orders like this usually led to long hours of explaining things to men who did not want to listen. He folded the sheet over in his hand. The station door burst open. Blair came in, smelling of whiskey and wet wool. His cheeks were flushed and his coat hung half off one shoulder. "What's that you're reading?" he demanded. Hamish held out the paper without comment. Blair snatched it, skimmed it, then tossed it onto a pile of old forms, as if it were nothing more than a bill. "Domestic rubbish," he said. "Some city madam wanting attention. I'm not ruining my Christmas pandering to her." "It's from Daviot," Hamish said. "I ken where it's from," Blair snapped. "You keep your nose out. You've Seeley's to mind. The villagers are already whining. You'll not be starting another fuss." Hamish knew better than to answer. Any reply would only make Blair louder. He bent to retrieve the sheet from the heap and slipped a fresh copy into his pocket, just in case the Strathbane machine lost it, or Blair later forgot he had ever seen it. Blair was already rummaging for the kettle, muttering that the place was freezing on purpose. Hamish stepped outside again, mostly to breathe. The air from the loch drifted up the road, sharp with the smell of coming snow. Lugs padded beside him, ears pricked, giving a low growl toward the dark stretch beyond the bridge. Hamish stared into the gloom but saw nothing. The dog's hackles were up all the same. "Maybe just a fox," Hamish murmured. Lugs didn't agree. Hamish touched the folded fax in his pocket. Christmas trouble always seemed to find Lochdu, and this year it had found it early. He felt the faint unease of someone already behind in a race he had not known he was running. He locked the station door, gave Lugs a final pat, and let the quiet settle too quickly around him. Something was wrong already, and he had no real idea what it was. The morning in Lochdu was already wrong. The thin sunlight had done nothing to thaw the ice on the road, and Hamish nearly slipped on his own doorstep. Lugs barked once, as if blaming him for the cold. Hamish pulled his jacket tighter and set off, hoping the dog would not drag him onto the frozen puddles. Crofters trudged past with the stubborn look folk wore when they had decided the day would be miserable no matter what. A few gave Hamish stiff nods. One muttered that the council never salted the roads properly. Another said something about tourists getting special treatment. Hamish nodded politely and did not bother defending the council. It never helped. Patel's shop was already busy. A tangle of tinsel drooped from the ceiling and looked as weary as the villagers. Inside, people shuffled about, glaring at one another as if Christmas shopping were an act of war. A tall, narrow man stood by the soup tins, turning a packet in his hand over and over. He had the pinched look of someone who slept poorly and expected trouble. When Hamish stepped inside, the man lifted his eyes. Dark, flat, watchful. Lugs let out a small whine. Hamish went to the counter for tea. Patel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "He came in on the early bus," he whispered, "asking about rooms. Didn't he say much? I didn't like the look of him." Hamish glanced again at the man, who now pretended to study the labels as though soup could hide him. Something about the set of his shoulders made Hamish uneasy, but he kept it to himself. Uneasy men often turned out to be harmless, and the loud ones were the bother. Still, the court order from the night before tugged at him like a burr stuck in wool. When Hamish stepped outside, the stranger was already ahead of him, leaning on the harbour wall and lighting a cigarette with hands that were not quite steady. Lugg stopped dead, tail stiff. "You'll be Kenneth Fraser," Hamish said. It was not a question. The man exhaled smoke in a long stream. "I'm just here for a quiet Christmas," he said. "A bit of fishing. Got off the bus early because I like the scenery." His eyes stayed flat. "There's an order," Hamish said. "You're not meant to go near Morag Drummond." Kenneth shrugged as if it were a minor inconvenience, like a late newspaper. "She's not worth the paper it's printed on. I'm no danger to anybody." His tone made the denial sound like an insult. Hamish watched him flick ash onto the ground. It was never the ones who sounded dangerous who caused the most bother. But Kenneth looked like a man who would step into trouble simply because it stood in his way. When Hamish phoned Blair from the station, Blair answered on the third ring, already in a temper. "I told you to leave it," he barked. "If he's daft enough to stand about in your wee backwater, he's not my problem. Don't you go upsetting Tommel Castle's guests with gossip." Hamish said that Kenneth was here, and that the order was clear. Blair snorted. "Aye, clear enough. Clear that it's rubbish. You keep your fussing for your Cayleys." Then the line went dead. Hamish stared at the receiver for a moment before putting it down. He felt foolish, as though he had overreacted. Lugs watched him, ears angled in question. Hamish gave him a dry pat. "Aye, well, you're not the one Blair shouts at." Still uneasy, Hamish drove up to Tommel Castle Hotel. The grand building looked even more disapproving than usual, its stone walls catching the thin light like an old lady judging the world. Inside, the warmth smelled of polish and unwanted money. Colonel Halberton Smythe met him at the front desk with the look of a man who regretted opening the door. "What now, Macbeth?" he demanded. "I'm checking guest lists," Hamish said. "There's a court order involving one of your arrivals." The colonel stiffened. "This is a respectable Christmas party, Macbeth, not the Old Bailey. I will not have police rummaging about alarming my guests." Hamish opened his mouth to explain, but the colonel raised a hand sharp as a slap. Two members of the staff stood nearby, eyes wide, listening too eagerly. "I have no troublemakers here," the colonel said, "and I will not have you inventing any." Hamish felt his face heat. He muttered something about checking for safety, but it sounded weak even to him. Priscilla came down the stairs just then, a slim figure in a pale coat. She glanced at Hamish as though he were part of the furniture, worn, dull, and in the wrong spot. She did not greet him. She simply walked past. The colonel watched her go, then turned back to Hamish. "You've embarrassed yourself enough for one morning. That will be all." Hamish left the hotel with the unpleasant sense of having been shooed like a stray dog. Outside, the icy air caught in his lungs. Lugs whined softly beside him. Hamish looked down the road toward Loch Dhu. Somewhere between the shop and the harbour wall, a stranger had slipped into the village with the confidence of someone who believed no one would stop him, and Blair had already decided he would not do a thing about it. Hamish headed back toward the station, wishing he felt certain about anything. The cold bit at his ears, and the dog stayed close, sensing the shift in his mood. The whole day felt like a thread pulled loose, and he was not sure what would unravel next. The trouble began before Hamish had even finished his morning tea. Mrs. Ross stopped him on the road, arms folded tight across her chest, and announced that the village was in a state because of something he had supposedly said in Patel's shop. She did not say what, only that he should keep his uniformed opinions to himself. Then she marched off toward the post office with the triumphant stride of someone who had delivered bad news and enjoyed it. By the time he reached the square, Lochdu was buzzing like a wasp nest. Lugs flattened his ears at the raised voices outside the post office. Mrs. Wellington stood behind the counter giving out parcels and gossip in equal measure. Hamish heard her telling the queue that the police were expecting a dangerous man from Glasgow, and that Hamish himself looked pale as milk this morning. Hamish stepped inside. The room went quiet in that falsely polite way that made the silence louder. Mrs. Wellington smiled at him in a way that meant the opposite of welcome. "Morning, Constable. Just telling folk to be cautious." "You're telling them rubbish," Hamish said. His voice came out sharper than he meant, and the woman at the front of the queue sniffed in disapproval, as if policemen had no right to raise their voices in public. Patel walked in carrying a crate of tinned peaches. "I didn't start anything," he said too quickly. "Folk only asked why you looked worried." "I wasn't worried," Hamish said. It sounded weak, even to him. Several faces showed they did not believe him. One elderly crofter muttered that he always knew city folk would find a way to ruin Christmas. Hamish hurried out before the whole place turned on him properly. Lugs trotted close, picking up the tension and pressing against Hamish's leg. "It's fine," Hamish muttered, though it was not. He could already hear his name drifting in fragments from passing doorways. By the afternoon, the wind coming off the loch had sharpened. Gossip sharpens quicker. Hamish drove to Tommel Castle Hotel with a sinking feeling. The place had hung its tasteful decorations, gold baubles and wreaths that looked too expensive to touch, but the atmosphere was sour. Staff hovered near the walls as if waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Colonel Halberton Smythe spotted Hamish at once and waved him over with the stiff impatience of a man trying to keep his temper in a public room. "Cancellations," he hissed. 3 in the last hour. If you've been spreading tales about violent Glaswegians' Macbeth, you will answer for it. 2 members of staff leaned in subtly, pretending to dust the sideboard while drinking in every word. "I've spread nothing," Hamish said. "Folk are jumping to conclusions." The colonel's eyes bulged. "Your village thrives on conclusions," he snapped, "and they think you're the source." Priscilla stood at the window, her pale profile outlined against the grey light outside. She did not turn when Hamish greeted her. "You always bring trouble where you go," she said softly, still looking out. The tone was mild, but Hamish felt it like a jab. He had no answer that would not sound childish, so he said nothing. A woman approached, tall, with an assured stride and a winter coat that looked too sleek for the Highlands. "Morag Drummond," she said briskly. "You must be the village policeman causing all this fuss." Hamish introduced himself, feeling awkward next to someone who looked as though she owned half of Glasgow. She laughed when he mentioned the non-harassment order. "Kenneth is a nuisance, not a murderer. Your superiors are jumpy. These things get blown up by the press." "It's not the press I'm worried about," he said, but she brushed it aside with an airy flick of her scarf. "I can handle him." That irritated him more than it should have. People who said they could handle things often couldn't. Still, Morag walked away before he could press the point, leaving him feeling like a fussing fool. When he stepped outside, dusk had pooled in the car park. Lugs stiffened and let out a low growl. Hamish saw 2 figures near the far wall, Morag and a man standing too close to her. Their voices were sharp, cutting through the cold air. As Hamish approached, he caught only a fragment from the man. "You promised, this Christmas or never." Morag's reply was lost in the wind. The man stepped back, retreating into shadow. All Hamish saw was a neat overcoat and the brief gleam of spectacles before the hotel door swung open behind him and spilled warm light across the gravel. The argument stopped at once, as though the light itself had shut their mouths. "Everything all right here?" Hamish asked. It sounded feeble. Morag gave a quick, brittle smile. "Perfectly." The man had already slipped away, leaving Hamish with the unpleasant sense that he had interrupted something he should have heard. Lugs barked once at the dark corner where the man had stood. Hamish made a note to ask the staff who wore spectacles. It was not much of a clue, but then little things often grew bigger if you left them long enough. Back in the village, the pub was crowded and sour. Crofters muttered that English guests always brought trouble and that Hamish was interfering above himself. Someone suggested he was trying to impress the hotel people, which drew a round of snickers. Hamish left before someone said it louder. He reached his cottage with a dull headache and the sense that he had made everything worse without understanding how. Lug settled by the fire, but even the dog's calm did not ease him. He lay awake longer than he meant to. A stranger in the shadows, a woman too confident for her own good, a village that smelled trouble and blamed him for inviting it in. He turned on his side, listening to the quiet of Loch Dhu. The quiet felt temporary. The trouble began before Hamish had even fastened his coat. During the night, the first proper snow had fallen, and now Loch Dhu looked pretty in that smug way places did just before they caused accidents. The road outside the station was a sheet of white hiding patches of treacherous ice. Lugs, delighted, bounded out the door and promptly skidded into a drift. Hamish sighed. The dog had more confidence than sense some mornings. He drove slowly toward the main road, tyres slipping now and again. Someone would have slid off the verge if he didn't check. Folk in Loch Dhu were good at many things, but winter driving was not one of them. At the lay-by, the Inverness bus was pulled over with its door open, letting out shivering passengers who pretended they wanted fresh air. The driver, a talkative fellow Hamish recognised, leaned out of his window. "Morning, constable. Road's a murder. Nearly lost us at Drumbane Corner. Had one of your lot yesterday." Hamish felt a small jolt. "One of mine?" "Aye. Tall, miserable-looking chap. Got off at Strathbane, thank God. Said he'd had enough of the Highlands." Hamish pulled out the photograph from the file, the one of Kenneth looking as though someone had just insulted him. The driver nodded. "That's him. Left here yesterday afternoon. Right fed up he was." Hamish stared at the snow on his boots. If Kenneth had gone to Strathbane yesterday, who had been standing near Morag at the hotel last night? Or had Kenneth come back some other way? The certainty he thought he'd had slipped away, thin as the melting ice by the wheels. He phoned Blair from the car. Blair answered in a voice already thick with annoyance. Hamish explained what the driver had said. "There you are," Blair snapped. "Man's away. You can stop panicking about your Christmas romance up at the castle." Hamish flushed. I'm not listening to more of your nonsense. Let the hotel folk enjoy themselves, and don't be dragging me into it every 5 minutes." The line went dead. Hamish muttered something rude under his breath. Lugs, hearing his tone, gave a sympathetic whine. At Tommel Castle, the snow had been cleared from the entrance in a way that made it look effortless. Wealth always made weather behave better. A new guest had arrived and was already holding court in the lounge. "An English QC," someone whispered. The man was smooth, confident, and had the shiny, polished look of someone who believed Scotland existed only to amuse him. He greeted Hamish with a booming, cheerful voice. "I say, marvellous place you have here, though I haven't yet seen a single crime. Do you Highland constables keep them hidden for tourists?" Hamish gave a thin smile. "Something like that." At the far end of the room, Morag Drummond listened to the QC flattering her, and the colonel drifted in now and then like an anxious schoolmaster, checking the behaviour of his pupils. The QC joked about investment deals and tidying up old problems. Hamish did not care for the phrase, but he dismissed it. Lawyers said things without meaning them, or meaning them too much. Hard to tell. Hamish found himself seated at the farthest chair during dinner, next to a woman who claimed to be allergic to anything with seasoning. He had no defence against her complaints, so he simply stopped listening. The QC laughed loudly at his own stories. Morag smiled at him with a brightness that seemed more like tolerance. Hamish decided, in a lazy sort of way, that the lawyer was harmless and dull. After returning to Loch Dhu, he went by the Kirk Hall, where villagers were rehearsing carols. There was already bickering about whether the tenors were too loud. Mrs. Grant pretended she hadn't seen him, and turned her back so sharply he nearly laughed. Someone shouted that the mince pies were stale. It was a normal rehearsal, which meant dreadful. Hamish waited in the foyer, glad to be out of the noise. Lug sat beside him, panting from the warmth. The payphone hung on the wall, its cord knotted from rough handling. Morag Drummond stood with the receiver pressed to her ear, speaking low and fast. He hadn't heard her come in. "I'm not paying for your mistakes any longer," she said sharply. "No, I said no. This is the last time. She slammed the receiver down with a force that made it swing. Hamish stepped forward. "Is everything all right?" She turned with a smile far too wide for the moment. "Just London business. You Highland men would be bored to death." Hamish doubted that. Boredom had never been Lochdu's problem, but he only nodded. Morag swept past him toward the hall, straightening her scarf as if she were late for an appointment she didn't want. In the background, Mrs. Grant had stopped singing to watch them, suspicion thick on her face. When Hamish met her eye, she sniffed and resumed her carol with unnecessary volume. Hamish stepped outside again, the cold snapping at his cheeks. Luggs nudged his hand, uneasy. Hamish looked back at the hall, the light spilling out onto the snow. Something about Morag's tone on the phone stuck with him, part anger, part fear. Hard to tell. He had the feeling, the small uncomfortable one he always got before trouble, that he had made a mistake somewhere already, but he didn't yet know which mistake it was. The village was quiet as he walked home, too quiet for Lochdu. The snow muffled everything but the distant hum of gossip already forming behind closed doors. Hamish paused outside his cottage, Luggs pressing close for warmth. The dog's breath rose in the cold air. "Something's wrong," Hamish murmured. Luggs whined. Hamish unlocked the door, but the unease followed him in like a draught he could not block. The morning was wrong before Hamish even opened the station door. The air outside felt too still, the sort of dull grey that made sound travel strangely. Luggs padded ahead, then stopped short, ears rising. A fisher from the village stood in the road, waving his arms with the panicked stiffness of someone trying not to appear panicked at all. "Constable, you'd best come quick," the man called. His voice was too loud in the quiet. "It's a woman, by the loch path." Hamish felt a coldness not caused by the weather. He followed at once, Luggs trotting at his heel, tail tucked in a way that warned him before he even saw the body. Morag Drummond lay at an awkward angle beside the narrow path, her smart coat smeared with wet earth. Her scarf was twisted tight across her collar. At first glance she might have slipped, struck her head on a stone. People slipped on that path every winter, but the scuffed marks in the mud told a different story. Someone had dragged or pushed, and the marks led too neatly toward the water. Luggs whined and backed away, refusing to get closer. Hamish crouched, but he kept his hands back. The ground looked disturbed, scraped clean in places, muddled in others. A bad fall, maybe, or not. He stood again, rubbing the back of his neck. "What kept you?" someone muttered loudly enough to count as bravery. He turned to answer and saw half the hotel staff gathered, along with several crofters who pretended they had only stopped by chance. Eyes followed him with the usual mix of hope and judgment. Then Blair arrived, roaring up the track in a burst of exhaust fumes, Anderson scrambling out behind him like a timid hen. Blair strode forward, nearly slipping on the ice. "Out of the way!" he bellowed, as if the entire scene had been staged to offend him personally. He looked once at Morag and puffed up like a bull. "This is exactly what happens when orders are ignored," he shouted. He reached into his coat and waved a crumpled fax above his head. Hamish recognised it at once, the same order Blair had dismissed days earlier, now crushed in his fist like a prop. "We were told," Blair thundered. "We were warned, but some folk didn't take it serious enough." He paused pointedly, turning to glare at Hamish. The gathered villagers followed his gaze, and Hamish felt heat crawl up his neck. Luggs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Colonel Halberton Smythe pushed through the crowd, his face white with outrage. "You will not make Tommel Castle into a circus, Sergeant," he snapped. "My guests are already terrified. You will lower your voice." Blair rounded on him, but faltered under the colonel's furious stare. Anderson coughed and pretended to examine the path. Priscilla stood at the edge of the group, arms folded, her expression cool and unreadable. She looked at Hamish only once, long enough to make him feel even more exposed, then looked away again, as though she had already decided he was somehow responsible. Hamish cleared his throat. "We should speak to all the guests first," he said quietly, "before chasing men who may already be gone." Blair swung toward him. "You had one job, Macbeth. Look after your wee village, now look." He flung an arm toward the path as if Hamish had personally dragged Morag there. A few of the villagers nodded, eager for someone else to blame. Hamish felt an old, familiar tightness behind his ribs. The cold air made it worse. Blair ordered Anderson to establish a cordon, though Anderson clearly did not know how. The crofters laughed at the sight of him fumbling with tape. Blair told them to mind their own business. They ignored him. Hamish turned away from the crowd, pretending to study the ground again. The scuffed earth, the twisted scarf, the way her shoe had caught on a root. None of it sat right, but Blair would never hear him now. Back at the station later, the quiet felt heavier than the noise outside. Hamish stood for a moment with his coat still on, staring at the papers on his desk. Lugg settled under the table with a sigh, ears drooping. Hamish reached into his pocket and took out the clean copy of the original court order, the one he had made before Blair tossed the facts aside. It felt heavier than paper should. He unfolded it slowly, tracing the date at the top. Blair had ignored it, had left it there. But if Strathbane saw the timestamp and the state of the crumpled sheet, there would be questions, and Blair would not take the blame. He never did. Hamish hesitated, the paper in both hands. He could send it straight to Daviot. It was the proper thing to do. It would also make Blair howl for weeks and turn the village into the next gossip spectacle. The idea of Lochdu dragged through the papers again made his shoulders tense. He folded the order once, twice, then he opened the drawer of his desk and placed it inside, closing it firmly. He turned the key in the lock. Luggs watched him, head tilted. "I'm protecting the village," Hamish muttered. It sounded thin, even to himself, but he left the drawer locked. Outside, the grey morning had darkened toward afternoon. Another quiet day in Lochdu, pretending nothing terrible could ever happen there. Hamish sat down, staring at the empty space on his desk where the facts had been. Something was badly wrong, and he had just made it worse. Rain started before dawn, steady and miserable, washing away what little snow remained. By the time Hamish stepped out of the station, the village looked darker than it should have, the sort of gloom that made everything feel smaller. Lugg slunk beside him, tail low, as if the dog sensed the villagers' mood before Hamish did. He went to the pub because it was better than sitting alone pretending to work. As soon as he walked in, voices dipped. A pair of fishers stopped mid-sentence. Mrs. Wellington, who had taken over the bar while the landlord fetched supplies, stared at him with the relish of someone vindicated. "A whiskey for the shock," she announced, pouring before he answered. Then, loudly enough for the whole room, "I told folk something bad would happen, but did anyone listen? No." Hamish muttered thanks and took the drink to a corner table. Luggs crawled under the bar stool, restless, pawing at Hamish's boot. The pub's warmth didn't help. It only made the silence more pointed. Mrs. Grant, perched at the counter, whispered something to her neighbour, who nodded and pretended not to look at him. If Hamish had caused the rain himself, they couldn't have been more accusing. He finished the whiskey quickly and left before the gossip sharpened any further. Tommel Castle felt no friendlier. Blair had taken over the lounge like an invading force. He stood near the fireplace, speaking loudly into the hotel's landline so everyone could hear. "Aye, sir. Kenneth Fraser is as good as arrested. All relevant papers are in hand. No mistakes on my watch." Hamish, sitting in a low armchair, winced at that. The drawer at his station desk seemed to follow him around, heavy with the hidden copy of the facts. If Daviot ever saw the timestamp against Blair's claims, the fallout would be awful. Not for Blair, of course. For Hamish. Just as he thought that, the hotel receptionist hurried over. "Constable Macbeth, a call from Strathbane." Hamish felt the familiar pinch in his stomach. He took the receiver. Daviot's voice came thin through the line, all polished irritation. "Macbeth, I need the original timings on that Glasgow order. Blair's paperwork is incomplete." Hamish swallowed. I think it might be misfiled, sir. I'll check again." "Find it," Daviot snapped, and the line died. He stood for a moment, staring at the receiver. Misfiled wasn't quite a lie and not quite the truth. It sat somewhere unpleasantly in between, like most things in his life lately. Luggs nudged his ankle, sensing the tension. He tried to distract himself with work. The English QC sat at a table near the window, flipping through a book he clearly wasn't reading. Hamish approached him with as much confidence as he could gather. "Where were you last night around 7?" Hamish asked. The QC smiled the kind of smile Hamish disliked. Smooth, pleasant, hiding everything. "With the Colonel in the library by the fire. Do ask him. He'll confirm it." Hamish nodded automatically. The thought of confronting the Colonel again made him weary, but he accepted the answer too easily. Something in his gut warned him, but he ignored it. He would regret that later. Back at the station, he wrote down the QC's alibi without questioning it. Only when he checked the doctor's estimate of death did the times refuse to line up. It was a stupid mistake, and he knew it. He put his head in his hands. Luggs whined. The phone rang again, but this time it was Patel. "Constable, a wee thing. Thought you'd want to know that Kenneth fellow bought a return ticket, and someone saw him getting off near the Croft Road last night. Just mentioning it." Hamish felt something lift. Hope, maybe. If Kenneth had returned, Blair's entire theory might unravel. He drove out at once, tyres slipping on the greasy road. The Croft stood small against the rain. Smoke rose from the chimney in a tired line. A woman opened the door before he knocked. Her lips were pinched in a way that suggested she had already decided what she would not say. "No one's staying here," she said. "I didn't ask yet," Hamish replied. She looked past him, avoiding his eyes. "No one's staying here," she repeated, firmer now. "Someone saw a man get off the bus near your track." "People see things wrong in the rain." Luggs sniffed the air, uneasy. Hamish tried again. "If Kenneth Fraser came here, he may be in danger himself. A woman is dead." Her face tightened further. Fear or stubbornness, it was impossible to tell. "We've had no visitors, that's all." He could have pushed harder. Instead, he nodded and stepped back. Something told him that pressing her would only make her shut the door sooner. On the drive back, rain hammered the windscreen so hard he could barely see. He felt every mistake piling on top of him. The misfiled facts, the unquestioned alibi, the Crofter's silence, the villagers' suspicions. Lochdew had shrunk around him, closing him into a corner he didn't quite understand. Back at the station, he sat at his desk staring at the locked drawer. It looked innocent enough. Inside was the truth, or at least one version of it. He rubbed his temples. Luggs rested his chin on Hamish's knee, warm and worried. Hamish looked at the dog. "I think I'm losing hold of it," he said quietly. The drawer stayed shut. The rain kept falling, and nothing in Lochdew felt steady anymore. The wind had already started its racket before Hamish reached Tommel Castle. It howled across the loch and slammed itself against the old stone walls, rattling windows as if trying to get inside. The place looked half abandoned despite all the money poured into keeping it respectable. Staff drifted about like uneasy ghosts, laying tables for meals no one seemed eager to eat. Something was wrong the moment Hamish stepped through the side door. A maid brushed past him without her usual shy greeting, her eyes fixed on the floor. Luggs followed Hamish in a slow, cautious trot, ears flattened against the noise of the wind. He found Priscilla on the terrace, smoking in the cold. Her coat was wrapped tightly around her, and her blonde hair whipped across her cheek. She looked at the loch as though it offended her. When she noticed Hamish, she lifted her chin a fraction, nothing more. He felt stupid before he'd even opened his mouth. Still, he tried. "Did you hear anything at the family dinner last night? Anything that might help?" She exhaled smoke in a thin line, annoyed. "Useful for what? The next scandal you stir up?" Her voice was cool, steady. "Morag was here to rescue Father's finances, not to be pushed off a path. We can't afford police drama scaring off guests." Hamish flushed. "I'm not making drama. I'm just asking." "Yes," she said. "You usually are." She flicked ash off the railing. "Anyway, I heard nothing. People don't confide in me about their business deals." "Someone mentioned missing money in Morag's company," he pressed. Priscilla turned to him fully, the movement sharp. "I'm not one of your informers in the village, Hamish. Try someone else." The distance between them felt wide enough to fall through. She stepped back inside, closing the door with more force than necessary. Hamish stood a moment on the terrace, feeling the cold bite at his fingers. Luggs nudged his leg, sensing the mood. He returned to the station long enough to ring Strathbane, hoping for support. Daviot answered, sounding busy with something far more important than a dead woman and a fretful Highland sergeant. "More officers?" "Impossible," Daviot said. "We're stretched thin with Christmas shoppers. You have Sergeant Blair. That should be sufficient." Hamish nearly laughed. "Blair is terrifying the hotel staff." "Then manage him," Daviot snapped. "And Macbeth, under no circumstances let the press hear that an official order was ignored. Do your job quietly." The line went dead. Hamish stared at the phone and muttered something Luggs wouldn't repeat if he could speak. Back in Lochdew, the Croft Road was slick with mud from the last 2 days of rain. The Crofter's wife opened the door before Hamish knocked. She looked tired and wary, as though she had spent the morning deciding what not to tell him. "No one's here," she said immediately. Hamish pointed to the jacket hanging by the stove. "Whose is that?" "A cousin's," she replied. "A cousin who arrived yesterday and left no tracks." Folk come and go, roads dry quick. Her eyes darted past him, checking if anyone else was near. Hamish tried again. If Kenneth Fraser stayed here, he may be at risk himself. She folded her arms tight. I said it's a cousin. Behind Hamish, Lugg sniffed the air, padding over to the jacket. The dog gave a small, uneasy whine, then nudged Hamish's coat pocket where the photocopy of Kenneth's file rested. Hamish ignored it and stepped back. If your cousin returns, tell him I was asking. He left her with that polite lie, which seemed the only kind she understood. He stopped at Patel's shop on the way back to the station. Patel was rearranging tins with needless fuss, eyes flicking to Hamish before returning to the shelf. Terrible business, he murmured. Terrible. Aye, Hamish said, waiting. Patel stalled a moment, then spoke in a lower voice. Morag Drummond came in a few days ago asking me about local charities. Something about investments moving north. And that English QC. Oh, he was full of suggestions. Tax efficiencies and all that. Sounded clever. Too clever, to be honest, if you ask me. Hamish felt a flicker of suspicion, which annoyed him because it competed with the larger worry in his mind. Kenneth still missing somewhere in the hills. Why didn't you mention this earlier? Patel shrugged. Folk mention lots of things, Constable. I never know which ones you want. That, Hamish knew, was Lochdu's favourite game. Pretend ignorance until it became useful. He thanked Patel anyway, even though it scraped his patience. He walked back to the station through a village that avoided his eye. A fisherman pretended to adjust his net rather than greet him. Mrs. Grant swept her front step in slow, suspicious strokes. A tourist asked him cheerily where to find the Kirk Hall, then walked off before Hamish answered, as if intending only to prove he wasn't invisible yet. Inside the station, he sat heavily at the desk. The drawer where he had hidden the original order seemed louder in its silence than anything else in the room. Lugg settled at his feet, chin on Hamish's boot, letting out a small, troubled sigh. Hamish rubbed his face. I've let this get away from me, he muttered. The rain resumed outside, soft but steady, pressing against the windows like a reminder. He could feel the next mistake waiting somewhere, just out of sight. He did not open the drawer. The storm had started before dawn, but by mid-morning it had turned vicious. Rain slanted across the lock in sheets, blown sideways by gusts that rattled the station windows like loose teeth. Hamish knew before stepping outside that he would be soaked through in minutes. Lugg stood at the door, tail wagging as if a Highland storm was something to celebrate. The dog had no sense. Hamish trudged toward the croft, water creeping down the back of his collar. The road was already beginning to flood, the ditches spilling over in muddy rivulets. Even through the roar of the wind he could hear the distant hammering of loose metal somewhere along the loch path. The whole village sounded on the edge of falling apart. The crofter was home this time. He opened the door with a look of resignation, as if he had been debating whether to pretend he wasn't in. Luggs barged past him at once and shook himself vigorously on the croft's hearthrug. The man sighed and waved Hamish inside. Over a mug of tea that tasted faintly of peat, the crofter leaned back and rubbed his forehead. Aye, Kenneth was here, he admitted. Wet as a drowned rat. Looked half mad. Hamish tried to keep his voice casual. Did he threaten anyone? Threaten? No. He was frightened, that's the truth of it. The crofter looked toward the rain-smeared window. Said he needed to warn Morag. Something about her London partner. Said the man would ruin her if she didn't listen. Rambling, aye, but there was fear on him, not anger. That picture of Kenneth, a desperate, frightened man, did not match Blair's story of a cold-blooded killer. Hamish felt that uncomfortable shift in his chest again, the one that meant he had been looking in the wrong direction. But it was easier, far easier, to suspect the man already written down in the order. He thanked the crofter and stepped back into the storm. Rain slapped his face so hard it stung. Luggs bounded ahead, delighted by puddles deep enough to drown a sheep. Hamish cursed under his breath and followed the dog back toward Lochdu, coat hanging off him like wet canvas. At the hotel bar, he found the English QC standing by the fireplace, speaking to two staff members who nodded as though they wished desperately to escape. When the QC noticed Hamish, he brightened in that false, polished way certain men used when they wanted to keep everyone off balance. "Constable Macbeth," he said warmly, "just admiring your local infrastructure. I've taken an interest in those roadworks along the loch path. Fascinating, really. One wonders how long they've been disrupting access." Hamish narrowed his eyes. "Strange hobby for a holiday." "Simply curious," the QC replied, still smiling. "Lawyers notice details." Hamish didn't return the smile. Something in the man's tone set his teeth on edge. Priscilla drifted over then, drawn in by the conversation or simply bored. She looked tired and brittle, as if the storm had found its way beneath her expensive coat. "He and Morag had a private meeting," she said abruptly, "the day before she died. Something about tidying up loose ends in a charity they shared in London." She stopped, lips thin, as though she had already revealed more than she wished. Hamish felt a small prickle of suspicion. Before he could ask more, Colonel Halberton Smythe appeared from nowhere, stiff as ever. "Purely business," he said. "Nothing to do with this tragedy, and that is all that needs saying." He shot Priscilla a sharp look before ushering her away. Left alone with the QC, Hamish gave him a long stare. The man held his eyes without blinking, then lifted his drink in a small, mocking toast. "To details, Constable." Hamish walked out before he said something he'd regret. The loch path was even worse in the storm. Mud sucked at his boots, rain lashed at his face. But he forced himself along the curve where Morag had fallen. There, half hidden by the weeds, were fresh tyre tracks, deep enough to show someone had driven over the closure sign or past it. Odd. No work crew should have been out in that weather. Lugs barked suddenly and trotted toward a pile of roadworks equipment, a heap of metal boards stacked neatly beside the path. He pawed at them, then barked again as a gust rattled the boards loudly. Hamish looked down, uneasy. Boards like that could steady someone on ice, or unsettle someone. The marks beside them were hard to read in the rain, but something had happened there. Something clumsy, or deliberate, he couldn't yet tell. Still, even as he crouched, his thoughts circled back to Kenneth. Too many years of village policing had taught him that the easiest suspect was often the wrong one. But Kenneth had run, hidden, lied, and Hamish could not shake the feeling of that order locked in his station drawer, its weight, its silence, its consequences. He stood, wiping rain from his eyes. The storm roared above him like some ancient beast, and Loch Dhu lay half-drowned in the distance, chimneys bent under the wind. "Come on, Lugs," he muttered. "We'll not solve anything tonight." The dog pressed close, shivering despite his thick coat. Hamish turned back toward the village, the storm pushing at his back. He had more questions now than he'd started with, and far fewer answers. The tyre tracks, the boards, the QC's sudden interest, the crofter's frightened visitor, none of it fit neatly. And Kenneth, wild-eyed and desperate, still haunted the edges of every thought. The rain only grew heavier as they walked. The storm had worsened overnight, hammering Loch Dhu until it felt cut off from the rest of the world. The telephone at the station crackled with every gust of wind, and when Hamish tried calling Strathbane, the line broke twice before Daviot's irritated voice came through it all. "Macbeth, I expect updates," Daviot barked, though half his sentence dissolved into static. "This matter must be contained. Do not—" The line died with a loud hiss. Hamish stared at the receiver. "A blessing," he muttered. The fax machine gave one last pathetic beep and stopped working entirely. Lugs, lying under the desk, whimpered at the noise. Blair stamped into the station then, soaked and furious. "This whole case is being ruined by Highland incompetence," he announced, tossing his wet hat onto a chair as if daring it to disagree. Anderson hovered behind him, looking as if he wanted to apologise for existing. Hamish ignored the insult. He had bigger worries. If Morag's papers existed anywhere outside Strathbane's reach, they would be at Tommel Castle. And if Blair got there first, the truth would be twisted before Hamish could see a single page. He made up his mind. "Stay here and deal with calls," Hamish said to Anderson. "We're losing the lines," Anderson said weakly. "Aye," Hamish replied, "but Blair will still blame you." Blair scowled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," Hamish said blandly, grabbing his coat before Blair could press further. By the time he reached Tommel Castle, darkness had settled in, thick and heavy. Rain sheeted across the courtyard. The hotel looked half asleep, its front rooms glowing, but the back corridors dim. Mrs. Halberton Smythe was busy directing staff in the dining room, which suited him fine. Hamish slipped into the small office off reception, grateful for the shadows. Lugs lay down in the corridor outside, ears pricked like a watchdog who didn't know what he was guarding but wanted to guard it anyway. Inside, Hamish searched through the filing cabinet. His hands were still cold, making the drawers stick. One fat folder marked North Charity Fund caught his eye. Another held documents with the Colonel's name at the top, projected investments, numbers that meant little to him except trouble. Before he could read further, footsteps clicked down the hallway. Hamish froze. The office had no rear exit. The only place to hide was under the desk. He slid himself beneath it, knocking his knee on the wood with a muffled curse. Dust coated his sleeve. His foot struck something that rattled, and he held his breath. The door opened. Mrs. Halberton Smythe entered first, her heels tapping with brisk annoyance. "I don't know why Father insists on keeping these old files here," she said. Priscilla followed, quieter but sharp-eyed even in the darkened room. Behind her came the English QC, brushing rain off his shoulders with exaggerated elegance. Hamish stayed perfectly still, knees aching. From his cramped position he saw only their shoes, but their voices carried clearly. "The policy is straightforward," the QC said. "With Morag gone, certain clauses activate, funds shift. They must go somewhere." "To Father?" Mrs. Halberton Smythe asked. "Possibly," the QC replied. "Depends how we handle it. The villagers mustn't be alarmed." Priscilla made a small sound, half warning, half disapproval. "Don't say too much here." "Oh, come now," the QC said lightly. "This is hardly Strathbane." He chuckled. "Highlanders never understand these things anyway." Under the desk, Hamish bristled. His back cramped. His left leg went numb. He tried to shift silently, but the movement sent a sharp pain up his thigh. He stifled a groan behind his teeth. And then Luggs, perhaps worried at the sudden silence, nosed the office door open. All three turned at once. Hamish saw Priscilla's shoes point directly at him. Then Mrs. Halberton Smythe gasped. The QC crouched slightly to look under the desk. His smile grew thin and delighted. "Is this normal Highland procedure, Constable?" the QC asked. Hamish crawled out, red-haired, lanky, dusty, knees cracking. "Just checking the locks," he muttered. It was a dreadful excuse, and even he heard how weak it sounded. Mrs. Halberton Smythe clutched her papers to her chest. "Under a desk?" Priscilla's mouth twitched, an almost smile, but cold, amused rather than kind. "You do find the strangest places to be, Hamish." I was leaving," he said, bumping his head on the desk as he stood too quickly. By the following morning, half of Lochdew had the story. Mrs. Grant announced in the post office that Hamish had been lurking like a spooked schoolboy, while a fisherman claimed Hamish had hidden under the desk for the better part of an hour, trembling. No one bothered to check their facts. Hamish sat alone in the station listening to the rain and the dying hum of the phone line. Luggs curled loyally at his feet. The embarrassment clung to him, heavy and stupid. He still did not know whether Morag's death was tied to insurance, the Colonel's finances, or some sleight of hand in London. But he did know they were all lying, each in their own tidy way, and Lochdew was laughing at him. He looked toward the filing drawer where the original order lay hidden. The storm rattled the windows harder. Something had shifted, and not for the better. The storm had blown itself out by morning, leaving Lochdew flat and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seemed offended anyone was still alive in it. The station felt even smaller than usual. The phone lines were useless, giving only faint crackles when Hamish lifted the receiver. Luggs sat by the door with an expression of betrayal, sensing Hamish was about to leave without him. "You'll only freeze in the car," Hamish said, though the dog didn't look convinced. He shut the door on Luggs's mournful eyes and started the engine. Hamish hesitated, then crossed to his desk, unlocked the drawer, and took out the folded copy of the Glasgow order. He slipped it into his coat pocket, shut the drawer again, and turned the key. The drive to Strathbane was long and silent. Frozen puddles cracked under the tyres. Hamish brooded over the pieces that refused to fit together. Kenneth frantic, Kenneth hiding, Kenneth returning, and yet the uneasy sense that Kenneth hadn't struck anyone. The thought annoyed him. He didn't like changing his mind. At headquarters no one wanted to help. Anderson had already arrived and was skulking by the lifts, giving Hamish a strained nod. The desk sergeant barely looked up. "I just need the Glasgow custody records checked," Hamish said. "We're busy," the sergeant replied without sympathy. They always made Highland requests sound like children asking for sweets. Hamish stood stiffly ready to leave when a younger officer, freckled, nervous, lifted his head. "I can look," he said quietly. The sergeant rolled his eyes but didn't stop him. The young officer typed for a minute, then frowned. Kenneth Fraser. Taken into custody at a Glasgow station the night before Morag Drummond was found. 6 o'clock. Breach of a domestic order. He's been held since. PO 25. Hamish stared at the page. Held since? Aye. Never signed out, never transferred. He's been in a Glasgow cell right through her time of death. Couldn't have been in Lochdu at all. Hamish felt the floor shift under him. His picture of the case, already cracked, now tilted sharply. He had believed Kenneth might have lashed out in fear or anger, but Kenneth had been in Glasgow, miles from Lochdu under lock and key. Blair stormed in at that moment, red-faced from the cold. "What's this nonsense?" he barked, hearing enough to be dangerous. "Someone's mixed up names." "No mix-up," the young officer murmured. "The file's clear." Daviot's voice exploded through a telephone moments later, someone having rushed to inform him. "I want the original facts," he shouted so loudly the sergeant winced. "The one with the correct times. This is a Christmas shambles." Blair jabbed a finger at Hamish. "Macbeth has it. He's been hiding it." Hamish felt something inside him snap. "I did no such thing," he said. "I kept a copy because the station fax was dying. You tossed the original into a pile of old forms and went for a drink." "You liar," Blair shouted. "You're blind," Hamish shouted back. Two junior officers froze mid-step. Anderson backed behind a filing cabinet as if expecting flying fists. The sergeant coughed meaningfully, but the two men ignored him. "Produce it," Blair demanded. Hamish reached into his coat pocket with stiff fingers and pulled out the folded paper. He slapped it on the desk. "There, read the timestamp." Blair's eyes darted across the page. His bluster faltered. "Well," he muttered, "it doesn't matter now." "It mattered when Morag was alive," Hamish said, his voice quieter but sharper. Silence spread through the room. Blair looked away first, muttering curses, and stomped out, Anderson scrambling behind him. Hamish left Strathbane with no satisfaction. Kenneth innocent meant someone else guilty, and everyone at Tommel Castle had been far too smooth for his liking. When he returned to Lochdu, the pub was full of forced cheer. Voices lowered the moment he entered. Mrs. Grant, polishing glasses, said, "So, it wasn't that Glasgow man after all." Her tone suggested Hamish had personally misled the whole Highlands. "It wasn't," Hamish said shortly. "A pity," murmured a fisherman. "Easier when it's an outsider." That truth hung heavy. The villagers did not want to suspect anyone with a name or a reputation. Respectable folk were meant to be above such things. It made them uncomfortable to think otherwise. Late afternoon found Hamish summoned to the terrace at Tommel Castle. Priscilla stood there wrapped in a thick coat, her face pale in the cold. She didn't waste time with greetings. "If you drag father's name through the mud," she said quietly, "we will never get out of debt. Choose your questions carefully." There was no warmth in her voice, only a tired warning. Hamish noticed she said we, not he. That told its own story, though he did not understand all of it. "I'm doing my job," he said. "Are you?" she replied. Then she turned and left. He didn't call after her. Pride stopped him, or maybe resignation. That night he walked down to the loch. The cold had sharpened since morning, and the air held a hollow stillness. Lugs pressed close to his leg, shivering slightly. Hamish stared out at the black water. Kenneth had an ironclad Glasgow alibi. The QC had been asking questions about the roadworks. The colonel had money problems no one wanted discussed. And somewhere among the guests, someone had found usefulness in a neglected Christmas order that Strathbane preferred to pretend was handled properly. The waves slapped softly against the stones. The killer was almost certainly among the people claiming to be respectable. Hamish felt Lugs lean harder against him, and he rested a hand on the dog's back. Not for comfort, just for something steady in the cold. The morning felt wrong from the moment Hamish stepped outside. The cold had settled into everything with a spiteful weight. Even Lugs hesitated on the threshold, sniffing the air as if it held some judgment. The storm had gone, but it left behind a stillness that made every sound seem louder. Hamish returned to the loch path first. He wanted to see it clean without rain-washing scents away. The marks were still there, scuffed earth just off the track, where someone had braced a foot, the faint impressions from the metal boards stacked nearby. Lugs padded ahead, nose down, tail stiff. When the dog reached the place he had barked before, he whined and rested a paw on the disturbed ground. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "Someone stood here long enough to think twice." He walked back to the village. The sun gave no warmth. It only lit the day enough for gossip to travel quickly. In Patel's shop, an old man was complaining about tinned soup. Patel barely listened. When Hamish entered, Patel hurried over, lowering his voice. "That lawyer," he said. "The English one. He was laughing yesterday about slippery Highland paths. Said you'd never know if someone fell on purpose or not." Patel shrugged as if disclaiming responsibility for repeating it. Hamish left with a tightening in his chest. Things were aligning, not neatly, but in the stubborn way truth sometimes did. Unimpressive, dull, and heavy. By afternoon, he had made up his mind. He told Blair everyone was to gather in the lounge at Tommel Castle. Blair grumbled, of course, but went, dragging Anderson behind him like a frightened shadow. The colonel looked affronted at the very idea of being summoned, but Mrs. Halberton Smythe insisted they should all cooperate for appearances. Priscilla stood to one side of the fireplace, arms folded, face unreadable. The QC lounged by the drinks cabinet, attempting a smile that no one returned. A Christmas tree blinked in the corner, its coloured lights flickering idiotically against the strained silence. Hamish stood awkwardly in the centre. He wished he could sink into the carpet, but he forced himself to speak. "Morag wasn't killed by Kenneth Fraser," he said. The room bristled. "He was in Glasgow. Turns out the police there can check their own records." Blair shifted, muttering something about clerical errors. Davitt crackled through a speakerphone on a side table, complaining already about confusion and communication breakdown. Hamish ignored all of them. "She died because someone needed her gone before she talked," he said, "before she exposed a crooked charity scheme involving this house." The colonel's face went crimson. "Now see here." "I'll see when I'm finished," Hamish said, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. He turned to the QC. "You asked about the roadworks the day before she died. You joked about icy Highland paths. You met her privately about tidying up loose ends. You knew about the policy that paid out when she died. You chose the path because one shove would look like a fall." The QC's face hardened. "This is absurd." "Is it?" Hamish lifted the paper he had retrieved earlier. "You counted on that Christmas order too. You knew Strathbane would be blamed for ignoring it. All you needed was for us to look in the wrong direction for long enough." The QC tried to laugh, but it came out thin, stretched. Priscilla watched him with a cold curiosity. Mrs. Halberton Smythe clutched her collar. Even the colonel took a step back as though something had brushed his conscience. Blair leaned forward, nostrils flaring. Hamish went on. "You said you were in the library by the fire, but the times don't match the doctor's estimate, and you never expected anyone to check. You thought Kenneth would take the blame because he'd been written down on paper." The QC's composure cracked. "It was only a push," he snapped. "She slipped. I panicked. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." His eyes darted around the room, searching for sympathy and finding none. "She threatened everything. You don't understand business, any of you." Blair lunged forward triumphantly, grabbing the man's arm as if he alone deserved the credit. "You're under arrest," he said, puffing out his chest. Anderson scrambled to assist, though he fumbled the handcuffs twice. Davitt's voice boomed from the speakerphone. "A swift resolution by Strathbane Police. Excellent work." No one in the room corrected him. When the QC had been taken away and the guests retreated in murmurs of shock, Hamish walked out into the courtyard. The cold snapped around him, sharp enough to sting. He didn't stay long. Back at the station, he fed Pete to the fire and sat heavily in the old chair. Lugs curled at his feet, warm and still. Lochdu was settling into a muted Christmas, but the village felt bruised, uneasy. Tommel Castle's reputation would survive. Such places always did. Villagers would rewrite their gossip by morning. Hamish stared at the kettle, thinking of the order that no one had obeyed. Orders were for show, he thought. Folk followed their own needs, not instructions. He stood, reached for the kettle, and let the fire fill the room with a steady glow.